Welcome back for another installment, and we'll be addressing the question of what cases best demonstrate the efficacy of nonviolence. And I want to take, again, a few different approaches for answering the question. Um, when I talk about efficacy, I frequently want to revisit some of the ideas covered in other segments, like our three satisfactions that we have the ability to feel successful when we have substantive satisfaction, which is that we have our substantive needs met, that our concerns are addressed. If there's been damages, that we've been able to recover or collect from the dollar amount for what the harm would be, or that we've been able to repair or replace the items that are missing or damaged. That we have an emotional satisfaction, which is that we feel good about what's happened, that we've gotten an outcome that gets to make us feel whole or respected, that what had been a time of disrespect and resentment and anger may no longer feel like it's a situation that fosters and harbors those feelings and sentiments. Or the process satisfaction, which is that sometimes it's just a matter of being a participant. Being a participant doesn't necessarily mean that you get the outcome that you wanted, what was desirable, but that you've been a participant, been able to engage. Right, in a democracy, the majority rules. So if you're in the minority and you don't get what you want, sometimes the issue isn't that you get what you want, but it's a chance that you had were able to participate in the debate, or that the principles, right, of the rights and liberties that are supposed to be afforded to all are still being honored, despite the fact that you're being denied some of what you want. Right, that the denial of what you want doesn't include the denial of things that you are or ought to be entitled to. So, so that said, success means different things, right? And being heard is a different kind of success than feeling good is a different kind of success than getting what you want. And at some level, actually, success is all of those things. And at another level, it is a matter of what you care most about. And frequently, we are able to prioritize and identify what it is that we want. But so if we're thinking about nonviolence and the success of nonviolence and the efficacy of nonviolence, we can frame it in terms of all three of those, right? Um, Again, statistically, nonviolence delivers better outcomes than violence does. From 1900 to 2015, nonviolence has been able to deliver the desired outcome approximately 51% of the time, and violence delivers on it about 27% of the time. So we could talk about efficacy in terms of delivery on outcome, and that would be thinking about the substantive concern. But when thinking about the cases, right, what are the cases that best reflect the efficacy of nonviolence? There's a second subset that I also want to be clear about, which is that actually movements can fail. And that when a movement fails, we're looking at opportunity costs and risks and so forth. So, one of the successes of nonviolence that I don't want to be lost is that when you fail in a nonviolent campaign, you just go back to the drawing board for the most part, right? You haven't made things worse. If you fail in a violent campaign, you usually have an inspired opposition who now has the justification for even more of the force or more of the denial of rights and so forth than what you had initially been up against. So, one of the things I just want to again highlight is that when you use nonviolence as a strategic element, when you fail to achieve the desired outcome, you rarely there are examples where things get worse. Don't get me wrong. There's always exceptions to the rule. But I could present some of the cases, and some of the cases ought to reflect that it didn't work out the way that it was planned, but it didn't make things worse. And so that's one of the details about the efficacy that I just don't want to miss. So, highlighting the efficacy, right? So, my heroes, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., are great examples, right? Um, Martin Luther King Jr. strategically used nonviolence along the same lines and the same tradition started by Gandhi. But I'll start with King first because it's a very familiar thing. We have iconic images, and this was part of the strategy that Martin Luther King Jr. was familiar with. He knew, I don't think he ever used the line, if it bleeds, it leads, but he was aware that it was these graphic images would be the types of things that would get headlines and coverage on the front page on newspapers across the country. And he knew that the problems in the South weren't isolated to just the South, but he was aware that there were broad patches of the United States of America where the type of racism and the type of segregation and the type of experience of oppression that was being experienced, but that he wanted to expose, wasn't taking place. And so if you can imagine this part of middle America, and Martin Luther King Jr. had this creativity, and he talked to people, and he understood that people could accept that things were bad, but regularly would say, I can't imagine it's that bad. So what he needed to do to pull out kind of the immoral curtain that was hiding what was happening was that he needed the images to get it into the dens and the living rooms of the average American all across the country. So he knew his nonviolent operation was actually not nonviolence on the whole, right? Because it was violence being visited against nonviolent protesters, right? But it worked, right? It worked. It's strategic. The images of the fire hoses being used to blast innocent teenagers and people with dogs biting them and the clubbing and the beating and the violence. And what this did, right, what these graphic images of violence did was they showed that conditions were as bad or worse than people realized, right? So step one of the efficacy here, step one of the example of the protests in the South is that there was a humanization process that took place when people could empathize and sympathize with the victims of oppression. And so nonviolence is what achieved that. Right? If the protesters took moments out of this campaign to fight back, to defend themselves, to do any of that, that would have immediately become the image, right? It would have been the violent resistance to the violent segregation. It would have been the violent resistance to the violent oppression. And that would have changed the narrative of the story. Changing the narrative of the story would have frequently been used as the justification for the force to begin with. That the police were then forced to use violence against protesters because the protesters were using violence against them, right? It's an unfortunate detail about how narratives are formed. But again, Martin Luther King Jr. was familiar with the way the story would be written, and he was masterful in kind of the creative exploration about how to get the message out. So the second part of this, the psychological pursuit, is that when you have people who are being called less than or savage or whatever, and they're not acting that way, that confronts and it jars and creates a cognitive dissonance. If the people are not acting in ways that they deserve to be treated in these images, what other things about them have we gotten wrong about the equality that they deserve? The third thing, though, is it's not just about the grassroots mobilization of spreading the awareness, and it's not just about the education, right? Making the political and social statement broadly accessible and actually forcing people to confront it. It's about actually interacting with the violent oppressors themselves. And in the South, we don't necessarily have good indication of that. It's probably the case that there were people who were beating innocent people who felt really bad about it and went home and shared those stories. But we don't have a lot of that testimony. We do, however, have that testimony coming out of Gandhi's India, where the troops and the police and the people that were asked to visit the violence against the nonviolent protesters talked about how discouraging and challenging that was, right? It's a story that we see surface in many parts of history. One of the most common pieces of defense for the atrocities of the Holocaust was, I was following orders. Well, that doesn't necessarily get people out of the trouble, but what we have to unravel with the human psychology here, and what I want the case of the Salt March and the protests in India to showcase, is that these people were demoralized. They were literally broken down by the process of, they couldn't bring themselves to continue, right? Soldiers that said, I can't do it anymore. I can't keep hitting these innocent people, right? The oppressors were worn down. Now, it's in some cases it happens from actual exhaustion, and that's really hard to imagine. Like somebody has beaten over and over innocent people with a club to the point where they can't actually do it anymore. They don't have the physical strength. But to understand that the psychology here of a willingness to take on the suffering in order to showcase a moral strong point, that happened. The soldiers let us know that they couldn't do it anymore, right? I don't want to say that things should have happened differently in the Holocaust, and that if people would have just been willing to suffer more, that we could have seen an end more rapidly or something. I'm not trying to make that implication that somehow or another the victims did wrong. I want to highlight, however, right? I want to highlight that oppressors have a harder time to oppress when the humanity of those being oppressed is showcased. And so these brilliant strategists, they understood how to do that. And both King and Gandhi both had experience of failed campaigns. That's right. They were great leaders, but not everything that they did worked. And so they went away from those projects. Again, they hadn't been exposed to elevated levels of risk. It's mostly time, energy, effort, right? Sometimes it's support. If you do something and people put their time and energy in, they might not feel as willing to participate in it the next time. But they would go back to the drawing board and say, why did the message fail this time, right? So you try it, you deliver the protest. If you don't get the desired outcome, you think about where you went wrong, what you can do, again, to get that message clear. And so then the last case I think I would give is that, we can bring down dictators with nonviolence. There have been many violent revolutions, and some of the violent revolutions have been successful, and many more have actually failed. And, and it's important to highlight that. But Slobodan Milosevic was brought down with nonviolent means in a time where other countries in that same time period and that same geographic era, the era and the area. I was getting a little bit ahead of myself. Slobodan Milosevic was not a gentle man. He was not a gentle leader, but when there was enough of the public responding and saying, like, we want you out, and literally putting their keys in there and jingling the keys, say, you're out. It worked. And it worked because of the elements that I've showcased or described, right? Those who were empowered to enforce the tyranny wouldn't do it. They couldn't bring themselves to oppress the people that they knew and loved and cared about and were familiar with, right? It was the humanity. Nonviolence is a way to pull one's humanity to the surface. And it's a very hard thing to do, right? It's very hard to subvert and oppress your equal. So nonviolence is the best means. Right? So the best examples are the cases of nonviolence that showcase an individual's full worth. And the best examples are the examples that showcase even when the movement fails, it doesn't hurt you. Thank you. See you in the next one.